All right, so we're going to look now at how to memorize the unit circle without constructing it from scratch using all of your special right triangles. So to memorize the unit circle, I use what I call the hand trick. So the hand trick is literally using your hand, specifically your left hand, so that your thumb is oriented up and your pinky is oriented to the side. And what we're essentially doing is we are taking the X and Y axis and assigning them to fingers along with each of the angles in the first quadrant. So the X axis corresponds to your pinky, so that's 0 degrees. And then the Y axis corresponds to your thumb, so that would be 90 degrees or pi over 2 radians. And then each finger corresponds to one of the angles in the unit circle. So your ring finger corresponds with pi over 6, your middle finger corresponds with pi over 4, and your index finger corresponds with pi over 3, or we could say 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. So once you know what each finger corresponds with in the first quadrant, you can figure out the coordinates using the hand trick. So if I want to know information about pi over 4, let's say I want to know the x and the y coordinates for pi over 4, which I know just from looking at my unit circle is square root 2 over 2. I am going to put that finger down on my hand. So I'm going to get rid of my middle finger because that was the finger that corresponded with pi over 4. Remember, 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. So I'm going to put down the finger that corresponds with pi over 4 on my hand. So I'm putting down my middle finger. Now on top of my hand, I have 2 fingers. However many fingers you have up, you're going to take the square root of that. So the square root of however many fingers you have. So square root of, in this case, 2. And then whatever you get, you always put it over 2. That's your x coordinate. However many fingers are on top, take the square root, always divide by 2. That's your x coordinate. And you do the same trick for the bottom. It's just this time that's your y coordinates. You take the square root of however many fingers, so square root of 2, and you always divide it by 2. So my x and my y coordinate are both square root 2 over 2. So square root 2 over 2, square root 2 over 2. And those are the coordinates for pi over 4, which match what's on the unit circle. So now let's do that, but with pi over 6. So I have to think about the first quadrant of the unit circle. So you do need to know in the unit circle that you have 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. You can think about the fact that it counts down. 6, 4, 3, 2. So if you can remember that the denominators count down, that'll help you figure out which finger to put down. So pi over 6 corresponds to the ring finger. So I'm going to put down the ring finger. Now if I want to figure out the x coordinate, I'm going to look at how many fingers are above my ring finger, which is 3. And I always take the square root of that. So square root of 3, and then we always divide by 2. So we have an x coordinate of square root of 3 over 2. If I want to figure out the y coordinate, so hang on, square root of 3 over 2 is the x. If I want to figure out the y coordinate, again, I'm looking at pi over 6, so I have my ring finger down. I have one finger on the bottom of my hand, so I'm going to take the square root of 1, and I always divide by 2. Well, in this case, the square root of 1 simplifies. The square root of 1 is 1, and then it's still always over 2. So my y coordinate is 1/2. And if I compare that to my actual unit circle, it does line up. Square root of 3 over 2, 1/2. If I wanted to know information about pi over 3, I would put down the finger that corresponds to that, which is the index finger. On top of my hand, there's one finger. So I'm going to do square root of 1, always over 2. So I get 1/2. So my x coordinate would be 1/2. And then if I want to know my y coordinate, below my index finger, I have 3 fingers. So that would be square root of 3. And then again, we always divide by 2. So for pi over 3, the coordinates are 1/2 square root 3 over 2. You could also do this if it was in degrees. I just happen to have it memorized better in terms of radians. And to be honest, in upper level math, you're more likely to see the angles written in radians as opposed to written in degrees. But of course, you could always figure out what it is in degrees. For me, it's easier to memorize in radians because I happen to know that the denominator is the same no matter what quadrant I'm in. So then the points are also similar no matter what quadrant I'm in. So for example, if I needed 5 pi over 4 instead of pi over 4, I would still do my hand trick with pi over 4 to figure out that the coordinates are square root 2 over 2, square root 2 over 2. I just have to figure out where is 5 pi over 4 on the unit circle to figure out what needs to be positive and negative. And to do that, I could use my trick of, okay, pi over 4 is in the first quadrant. 2 pi over 4 simplifies, so I don't worry about that. 3 pi over 4 then is going to be in the second quadrant. 4 pi over 4 simplifies, so I don't worry about that, which gets me to 5 pi over 4, which is in the third quadrant. I know in the third quadrant both values are negative. So if I needed to know information about 5 pi over 4 instead of just pi over 4, once I did my hand trick, I would figure out what quadrant it is and know that both of them need to be negative. All right. So we've looked at all of those. We could also do this with 0 or with pi over 2. So for example, if I wanted to figure out information about 0, I would put down my pinky because that's the finger that corresponds to 0. Now above my pinky, there are 4 fingers. So I take square root of that, square root of 4, and I always divide by 2. Square root of 4 is 2. 2 over 2 simplifies to just 1. So at 0, my x-coordinate needs to be 1. For my y-coordinate, I want to know how many fingers are below my pinky. Well, there are no fingers below my pinky. There are 0 fingers. Square root of 0 is 0. Always over 2 is 0. So I get 1, 0, which matches the coordinates at 0. And I could do this again for pi over 2 or 90 degrees. I would put down my thumb because that's the finger that corresponds to 90 degrees. So for my x-coordinate, I have no fingers on top, which would be 0. And then for my y-coordinate, 4 fingers on bottom. So I take the square root of 4, always divide by 2. 2 over 2 is going to give me 1, so I end up with 0, 1 for my coordinates. And again, if I needed any information about something in a different quadrant, I would start with my first quadrant coordinates, because those I can memorize with my hand trick, and then just figure out what quadrant my angle is that I'm looking for. So if I needed information about 300. So for me, it's a lot easier to think about that in radians and not in degrees because I know in radians what corresponds. So if I can figure out that 300 is 5 pi over 3, I know that I need to do my hand trick with pi over 3. So I always go to radians first instead of degrees. Once I'm in radians, then I do my hand trick and figure out what quadrant I'm in to figure out if it needs to be negative or positive. And that's how I memorize the unit circle. Now, to be honest, in upper level math, like calculus specifically, you're mostly going to be living in the first quadrant when you're evaluating things, or at your special angles like pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. You're less likely to have to do anything with like 7 pi over 4 or 4 pi over 3. Those are just less likely to show up. Overall, you're more likely to see quadrant 1 as well as all of your axes. So the way this trick is especially helpful is not just for figuring out the x and y coordinate, but like we talked about in the last video, for finding information about sine, cosine, or any of your other trig functions, but in particular, sine and cosine are the most common. So if I wanted to know something about sine or cosine, let's say I wanted to know what is sine of pi over 2. First thing I have to remember when I see sine is that that corresponds to the y value on the unit circle. Now I'm going to use my hand trick to help me figure out where is pi over 2 and what is sine. So sine of pi over 2, I know that pi over 2 corresponds to my thumb, and sine is the y value, so I need to see how many fingers I have on bottom. So square root of 4 divided by 2 gives me 2 over 2, which gives me 1. So sine of pi over 2 is 1. The y value at pi over 2 is 1. If I needed to know cosine of pi over 6, I'm going to put down my ring finger because that's the finger that corresponds to pi over 6. And I know that cosine is the x value for the coordinate on the unit circle. So now I'm looking at my x value, which would be how many fingers I have on top of my hand. So I do square root of 3. I always divide by 2. My x value at pi over 6 is square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 6 is square root of 3 over 2. So that's why that hand trick is especially helpful, not just for memorizing the unit circle, but also for helping with evaluating sine, cosine, and you could of course use this for the other trig functions, but sine and cosine are the most common. All right, so work on using that pattern, using that trick to help you figure out the unit circle. That way you can use it in calculus this year. Let me know if you need help still.